There are some things in this world that a person cannot look at directly, not because they are hidden, but because the very sight of them is more than a mortal soul can bear, a horror so complete that to gaze upon it full in the face is to be frozen, turned to cold stone, lost forever. This is the story of the young man who was sent to kill exactly such a thing, a monster whose face no living creature could look upon and survive a horror that had turned 100 heroes into statues scattered across a lonely island at the edge of the world. And it is the story of how he did it, not by being braver than those 100 heroes, nor stronger, but by understanding a single, strange, and quiet truth, that the only way to face the thing you cannot bear to look at is to refuse to look at it directly at all, and to face it, instead, through a reflection. But before any of that, before the monster, before the winged sandals and the severed head, before the sea serpent and the rescued princess, this story begins, as so many of the darkest stories do, with a man trying desperately to escape a future he had been warned was coming. For everything that follows was set in motion by a grandfather who was told how he would die, and who spent his whole life running from that death, and who, by running from it, ran straight into its arms. This is the tale of Perseus, and it begins with a prophecy, and a locked door, and a king who could not bear what he had heard. In the ancient city of Argos, there ruled a king named Acrisius, and he had no sons, only a single daughter, a young woman of great beauty named Dana. And this troubled Acrisius, for a king wants an heir, a son to carry on his line and hold his throne after him. So he did what troubled kings in these tales so often do. He journeyed to the oracle to ask the gods whether he would ever have a son. But the oracle did not answer the question he had asked. Instead, it gave him a warning he had never wanted, a prophecy far darker than any childlessness. "You will have no son," the oracle told him, "but your daughter Danae will bear a son, and that grandson, when he is grown, will one day kill you." It fell upon Acrisius like a stone. He was going to be murdered, the oracle said, by his own daughter's child, by a grandson not yet even conceived. And from that moment, Acrisius became a man consumed by a single terror and driven by a single desperate plan to make certain that Dana never bore a child at all. For if she never had a son, then the grandson who would kill him could never be born, and the prophecy would be broken, and he would live. It seemed to his frightened mind so simple. And so he did a cruel and terrible thing to his own daughter. He built a chamber, some say of bronze, sunk deep beneath the earth, and some say a tower with walls no man could climb. And into this prison he locked Danae, alone, with only a narrow opening to the sky for air and light, and guards to see that no man ever came near her. He would keep her there, sealed away from all the world, from every possible suitor, for the rest of her days, if he had to, so that she could never conceive, and the prophecy could never come true. Sit for a moment with what he had done. To save his own life, a father imprisoned his innocent daughter in a sealed chamber underground, condemning her to a lifetime of loneliness for a crime she had not committed, and a child she had not borne. It is the first and one of the darkest of the many cruelties in this tale that spring not from wickedness for its own sake, but from fear, from a man so desperate to escape his fate that he would do any evil to try. And it did not work. Of course, it did not work. It never does in these stories, for there are walls that can keep out any mortal man, but there are no walls that can keep out a god. For high on Olympus, Zeus, the king of the gods, had seen the beautiful Danae in her prison, and he desired her. And no bronze chamber, no tower, no locked door, and no watchful guard could keep out the Lord of the sky. Zeus came to Danae in the most extraordinary of all his many disguises. He came to her not as a man, and not as a beast, but as a shower of golden rain, pouring down through the narrow opening in the roof of her prison, the one gap her father had left for air and light, falling upon her as a cascade of living gold, light itself made tender. There is a quiet and beautiful irony in that image that the old tellers surely intended. Acrisius had sealed his daughter away behind walls of bronze precisely so that nothing could reach her. And it was through the single small opening he had left, the one mercy of light in her prison, that her fate found its way in. The very completeness of his precautions became their undoing. For a man may wall out the whole world and still not wall out heaven, and the more perfectly he seals the door, the more surely fate comes down through the roof, as gold, as light, as the one thing he never thought to guard against. And in that strange and beautiful visitation, Danae conceived. And in time, alone in her sealed chamber, she gave birth to a son. She named him Perseus. For a while, she managed to hide him. This child born in a prison, keeping him quiet, keeping him secret from the guards and from her father. But a growing child cannot be hidden forever. And one day, the sound of the boy at play reached the ears of Acrisius, and the king came and saw and understood with a cold horror exactly what had happened. The grandson the oracle had promised, the grandson who was fated to kill him, had been born after all, born inside the very prison he had built to prevent it. His whole cruel scheme had failed. The walls he had raised against fate had not kept fate out. They had only made his daughter suffer for nothing. And now, faced with the living proof that the prophecy was coming true, Acrisius was more frightened than ever, and more desperate. But here his terror ran up against another, older terror. He wanted the child dead. Of course he did. A dead grandson could kill no one. But he did not dare to kill the boy, or his daughter, with his own hands. For to spill the blood of one's own kin, to murder one's own daughter and grandchild directly, was among the very darkest of all crimes in the eyes of the gods. A pollution that would bring the Furies themselves howling down upon him. Acrisius was willing to do almost anything to escape his fate. But he was not quite willing to damn his own soul with kindred blood spilled by his own hand. And so he found a coward's compromise, a way to be rid of them without technically killing them, a way to let fate or the sea do the murder for him, while he kept his own hands clean. He took his daughter and her infant son, and he sealed them together inside a great wooden chest, and he had the chest carried down to the shore and cast out upon the open sea, to be swept away by the waves, to drift wherever the water took them, to drown or to starve or to be lost, far from Argos, far from him. He told himself no doubt, that he had not killed them. He had merely let them go. Picture that chest upon the water, if you can bear to. A young mother and her newborn baby, sealed in the dark, tossed on the open sea, at the mercy of the waves and the wind, with no oar and no sail and no way to open the lid from within, drifting out into the vast and empty ocean to whatever end the gods decreed. It is one of the most haunting images in all the old stories. The box upon the sea. The mother singing softly to her frightened child in the dark, begging the waves to be gentle, begging the sleeping baby not to know how much danger he was in. And there is an old and beautiful fragment of a poem, thousands of years old, that gives us Danae's voice in that terrible dark, murmuring to her son as the water heaves beneath them, telling the child to sleep while the sea rages, and trusting, against all reason, that they would somehow be saved. In that ancient poem, she looks down at her baby, warm and untroubled in his little cloak, sleeping through the storm that could kill them both at any moment, and she marvels at his peace, and she is almost broken by it. "My child," she says, "what trouble I am in, and yet you sleep. You slumber on in this joyless brass-bound box, in the dark of the night, on the gray salt water, careless of the waves that break above us, and the spray that soaks my hair, careless of it all. Sleep, little one," she tells him. "Sleep, and let the sea sleep, and let this measureless trouble sleep." And if her prayer is a wild one, if she has no reason on earth to hope, she prays it anyway, that some change of fortune might come to them from Zeus, the father of the child she holds. There is something almost unbearably tender in that image, and it is worth staying with, for it is the true beginning of everything heroic in this tale. Before Perseus was ever a hero, before he ever lifted a blade or faced a monster, he was a sleeping baby who owed his life entirely to the fact that his mother did not give up, that in a sealed box on the open sea, with no oar, sail, and no to believe, she held her son and sang to him and refused, against all the evidence, to stop hoping. The courage of Perseus began. In the courage of Danae, in the dark, on the water, keeping faith when there was nothing at all to keep faith in. And they were saved. For Zeus had not forgotten his son. The chest did not sink, and it did not break, and after long days upon the water, it was carried, at last gently, to the shore of a small island far away, an island called Seriphos. There, on the beach of Seriphos, the chest was found by a fisherman named Polydectes, a poor and humble and good-hearted man, who was casting his nets in the shallows, and drew up, instead of fish, this strange great box from the sea. And when he opened it and found inside a half-starved young woman and her tiny baby still alive, he did not turn them away, and he did not report them to be sold or enslaved. He took them home. He and his wife, who had no children of their own, took in the castaway mother and her son, and they raised the boy, Perseus, as if he were their own, in their simple fisherman's home by the sea. And so, by the kindness of a poor stranger who owed them nothing, the mother and child, who had been thrown away by a king, survived, and found a home and grew. It is worth pausing on Polydectes, for he is easy to overlook among the gods and monsters, and yet the whole story turns on his simple decency. A powerful king gripped by fear, had tried to destroy this child. A poor fisherman, moved by nothing but kindness, saved him and raised him. The great and the mighty in these tales are so often the source of cruelty, and it is the humble and the overlooked who quietly hold the world together with their goodness. Remember Dictys. His kindness will matter at the very end as much as any hero's sword. And under his kind roof, Perseus grew from the baby in the box into a strong and capable young man, tall and brave, beloved of his mother, who had never told him the full truth of how they came to the island, nor the name of the grandfather who had cast them out to die. He grew up, as far as anyone knew, an ordinary fisherman's foster son, learning the sea and the nets, running on the beaches of Seriphos, knowing nothing of prophecies or golden rain or the throne of Argos far across the water. And there is something quietly important in that ordinary childhood, humble and safe, and full of a mother's love given to him by a poor man who owed him nothing. For the child who had been thrown away by a king in a palace was raised up by a fisherman in a hut, and it was the fisherman's kindness, not the king's cruelty, that shaped the man he became. Perseus grew up loved, and that is perhaps why, unlike so many heroes wounded into hardness by cruel beginnings, he grew up kind, able, when his own moment came, to keep faith, to be grateful, to love his wife and honor those who had helped him. The gods gave him the winged sandals and the mirrored shield. But it was Dictys who gave him the thing that mattered more, which was a childhood worth having, and a heart that knew what loyalty was, because it had been shown loyalty first. But the island of Seriphos held a danger, and it did not come from the sea. For Dictys, the kind fisherman, had a brother, and his brother was Polydectes, the king of the island. And Polydectes was everything his brother was not: proud, cruel, grasping, and cold. And as the years passed and Danae remained on the island, still beautiful, even in her middle years, King Polydectes came to desire her, and to want her for himself. But Danae did not want him, and refused him. And she had a protector now, for her son Perseus had grown into a strong young man, who stood between his mother and the king's unwelcome attentions. And Polydectes did not quite dare to simply seize her by force while her son was there to defend her. And so the king came to hate the young man, this Perseus, who stood in the way of what he wanted, and he began to think of how he might be rid of him. And Polydectes was cunning. He did not challenge Perseus openly. Instead, he devised a trap, as clever and as cruel in its way as anything Peleus had devised for Jason, or Minos for the children of Athens. He let it be known that he had given up his pursuit of Danae, and that instead he intended to marry another woman, a princess named Hippodamia. And he declared a great feast, and announced that every man on the island must bring him a gift worthy of a king's wedding. And the customary gift, the expected gift, was a fine horse. So each of the young men of Seriphos came to the feast, bearing horses, the proper tribute for a royal marriage. But Perseus was poor, the son of a castaway, and the foster son of a fisherman, and he had no horse to give, and no wealth to buy one. And this was exactly what Polydectes had counted on. When the young man came empty-handed and stood shamed before the whole court, with no gift to offer, the king turned the trap upon him. "Perhaps," said Polydectes with false sweetness, "since you have no horse, you might bring me some other gift instead, some greater gift, worthy of a hero." "Perhaps," the king said, watching the proud young man's face, "you might bring me the head of the Gorgon Medusa." It was a masterstroke of cruelty, and it worked precisely because it used the young man's own pride against him. Polydectes said it lightly, almost as a jest in front of the whole assembled court, and every man there understood what it meant. For the head of Medusa was a byword for the impossible, the thing that got men killed. To ask for it was to ask for a death, and Perseus, standing shamed and empty-handed before the sneering faces of the wealthy young men with their fine horses, felt the sting of it, and felt the whole court watching to see whether the poor castaway would cringe. And his pride would not let him cringe. Perhaps, too, some part of him understood that the king wanted his mother and hated him, and that here was a chance to prove himself a man and not a boy to be brushed aside. Whatever the mixture of pride and anger and youth that moved him, Perseus, stung by the mockery and too rash to see the trap closing around him, answered before he could think better of it. He drew himself up before them all, and he swore before the whole court that he would do exactly that. He would bring the king the head of Medusa, and more, he boasted, he would bring back the very head itself, and not fail. And the moment the words were out of his mouth, the trap sprang shut, for an oath sworn before the whole court could not be taken back, without a dishonor worse than death. And the king had what he wanted, and Polydectes smiled, for he had gotten precisely what he wanted. He had bound the young man by a public oath he could not now take back without disgrace, to a quest that was certain, absolutely certain, to be the death of him. For no one who had ever gone to face Medusa had returned. To send a man after the Gorgon's head was simply a slower and more honorable way of sentencing him to death, and it would take Perseus far away from Seriphos, and leave Dana alone and unprotected, exactly as the king desired. For the Gorgon Medusa was one of the most terrible beings in all the world. There were 3 Gorgon sisters, monstrous winged creatures with faces of horror, with tusks like boars and hands of bronze, and, in place of hair, a writhing mass of living, hissing serpents, crowning each of their heads. But 2 of the sisters were immortal, and could not be killed at all. Only the 3rd, Medusa, was mortal, and it was her curse, and the curse of all her kind. That was the true horror. For the face of a Gorgon was so hideous, so unbearable, that any living creature who looked upon it directly, who met those eyes for even an instant, was instantly turned to stone. Around the lonely lair of the Gorgons, at the far western edge of the world, there stood a silent garden of statues, the stone figures of men and beasts, frozen in attitudes of terror. The remains of everyone who had ever come to that place, hoping to slay the monster, and had made the single fatal mistake of looking upon her face. They stood there still, gray and cold, a whole gallery of failed heroes, turned to stone in the instant of their courage. Imagine coming to that place. Imagine being the next young man to walk into that silent stone garden at the edge of the world, and seeing them, the warriors, frozen mid-stride, swords still raised, faces still fixed in the expression of the last thing they ever saw, the terror or the resolve caught forever in cold gray rock. Every one of them had been brave. Every one of them had come, as you had come, certain that he would be the one to succeed. And every one of them had made the single unavoidable mistake, had looked, for just one instant, upon the face he had come to destroy, and had been added to the garden of the dead. There was no lesson to be learned from their failure, no clever trick they had missed, for their failure was simply the nature of the thing itself. To face Medusa was to look at Medusa, and to look at Medusa was to die. The horror was not that she was strong, or fast, or armed. The horror was that her mere face, glimpsed for a heartbeat, was fatal. That a man could do everything right, could be braver and stronger than any who came before, and still be turned to stone the moment his eyes met hers, before he ever struck a single blow. It was a problem that courage alone could not solve. It was, in fact, a problem that courage made worse, for it was the bravest men, the ones who dared to look their enemy in the face, who died the fastest. That was what Perseus had sworn, in a moment of wounded pride, to go and face. And there are some who tell a sadder story still of how Medusa came to be a monster at all. For it is said by some that she had not always been a horror, that once, long ago, she had been a beautiful young woman, most beautiful of all in her hair, a maiden who served in the temple of the goddess Athena. And it is said that the sea god Poseidon, seized by desire, violated her within the sacred temple itself, and that Athena, in her cold anger, turned her fury not upon the god who had done the wrong, whom she could not punish, but upon the girl who had been wronged, and transformed the beautiful maiden into the snake-haired monster, whose gaze turns men to stone. If that darker version is true, then Medusa was not only a monster to be slain, but a victim twice over, punished for a crime committed against her, made hideous for another's sin, and finally hunted down and beheaded for being the very thing she had been cursed into becoming. It is worth holding both of these truths at once, as the old stories often ask us to, that Medusa was a deadly horror that had to be stopped, and also, perhaps, a wronged and tragic soul who had never asked to become what she was. The best of the old tales rarely let us hate their monsters cleanly. Perseus, then, had bound himself by oath to a quest that everyone understood to be hopeless. He did not even know where the Gorgons lived, at the hidden western edge of the world, and even if he found them, he had no way to kill a creature he could not look at, and no way to survive the two immortal sisters, who would surely tear him apart. He was a poor young man with a sword and a rash promise, sent to die. But Perseus, unlike Jason, unlike so many heroes, did not have to face his impossible task alone, for he had caught the attention of the gods themselves. For Perseus was a son of Zeus, and more than that, the whole affair touched the honor of two of the great Olympians. The goddess Athena had her own reasons to want Medusa dead, whether out of the old grudge from the temple, or simply as the patron of heroes and of wisdom. And Hermes, the swift and clever messenger god, the guide of travelers, and the patron of every kind of cunning, took an interest in the young man as well. And so, as Perseus set out despairing, not knowing even which way to go, the two gods came to him and offered him their help, and set his feet upon the path. But notice the shape of the help they gave him, for it is the heart of the whole tale. They did not simply hand him the monster's head. They did not fly to the Gorgon's lair and kill Medusa for him. What they gave him, above all, was not strength, and not a weapon, but knowledge and wisdom. The understanding of how a thing that seems impossible might, by cleverness and by indirection, be done. And the first thing they told him was that before he could find the Gorgons, he must first find someone else. 3 strange sisters who alone knew the way, and who would never willingly tell it. The Graeae. The Graeae, the Grey Sisters, were 3 ancient hags, sisters of the Gorgons, who had been gray-haired from the day of their birth and had never been young. And between the 3 of them, they possessed only a single eye and a single tooth, which they passed from hand to hand, taking turns to see and to eat, so that at any moment 2 of them were blind, while one of them held the eye. They lived in a gray twilight at the edge of the world, and they alone knew the secret road to the Gorgons and to the nymphs who guarded the magical treasures Perseus would need. But they would never tell him willingly, for they guarded the secret jealously. So Hermes and Athena taught Perseus a trick, a piece of cunning worthy of the cleverest of the gods. It required, above all, patience. Perseus came to the gray twilight, where the 3 ancient sisters dwelt, and he did not rush in, and he did not announce himself. He hid, and he watched, and he studied them, these strange primeval hags, older than the gods almost, gray from birth, passing their single shared eye and their single shared tooth back and forth between them, so that the whole rhythm of their existence was a constant handing over, a perpetual exchange in the gloom. And Perseus waited for his moment, watching that endless passing of the eye, learning its rhythm, marking the instant in each exchange when the eye left one withered hand and had not yet reached the next, the one heartbeat in which all 3 sisters were blind together. And when that instant came, when one sister lifted the eye from her socket to pass it on, and it hung for a moment in the empty air between them, Perseus's hand darted out of the darkness and snatched it clean away. And suddenly he held in his own hand the one eye that all 3 sisters shared, and all 3 of them were blind and helpless and at his mercy. And he told them, "I have your eye, and I will not give it back. I will throw it into the sea, and you will be blind forever, unless you tell me the way to the nymphs who guard the sacred gifts, and the road to the Gorgon's lair." And the Grey Sisters, robbed of their sight and unable to resist, had no choice but to tell him everything he wished to know. And when they had told him, he returned their eye and left them and went on his way, now knowing at last where he had to go. Notice, again, if you will, how Perseus overcomes each obstacle, not by force, but by wit, not by looking his enemy in the eye, but by clever indirection, by catching them in the one blind instant, by taking hold of the very thing they needed most and using it to bend them to his will. This is a hero who wins by thinking, by patience, by turning his enemy's own nature against them. And that same method, the sidelong approach, the refusal to meet the horror head-on, was about to save his life against the greatest horror of all. And so, Guided now by the secret he had wrung from the Grey Sisters, Perseus set out across the vast and unknown reaches of the world, farther than any ordinary traveler had ever gone, for the nymphs and the Gorgons alike dwelt at the very edges of the earth, in the far places beyond the last known lands, where the maps ran out and the world gave way to mist and legend. He journeyed to the limits of the west, where the sun goes down into regions no mortal foot had trodden, trusting the strange directions of 3 blind hags, because they were all he had. It is worth remembering, amid all the magic that follows, how much of what Perseus did was simply this: to keep going, alone, into the unknown, toward a place no one could describe and a task no one had survived on nothing but the word of the gods and the thin thread of a stolen secret. Following the directions wrung from the Grey Sisters, Perseus came at last to the nymphs, the guardians of a set of wondrous magical gifts, and with the favor of the gods upon him, they gave him everything he would need. They gave him a pair of winged sandals, like the ones Hermes himself wore, by which a man could fly through the air as swiftly as a bird. They gave him a special pouch, a magical bag called the Pegasus, exactly the right size and made for one particular, terrible purpose: to safely carry the severed head of the Gorgon, so that, even in death, its deadly gaze could not escape and do harm. And most precious of all, they gave him the cap of Hades, the helm of the Lord of the Dead, which had the power to make whoever wore it completely invisible, unseen by any eye, mortal or immortal. Consider for a moment the strange and perfect wisdom of these gifts, for not one of them is a gift of raw power, and together they are a lesson in how the impossible is truly overcome. The winged sandals would let him reach a place no ordinary traveler could reach, and flee it faster than any monster could pursue. The cap of invisibility would let him pass unseen, so that the 2 immortal sisters, whom he could never kill, would never be able to find him. The special pouch would let him carry away the deadly head without being harmed by it, even in victory. For a lesser hero might slay the monster and then be turned to stone by the severed head he carried home. And so the gift thought even of that. Each gift answered not a test of strength, but a specific, practical problem that raw courage could never have solved. And to these gifts the gods added their own. Hermes gave Perseus a weapon fit for the task, an unbreakable sickle, or curved blade, of adamant, the hardest substance in creation, hard enough to shear through the Gorgon's neck, where an ordinary blade might have shattered or turned aside. And Athena gave him the most important gift of all, the gift that was the true key to the whole quest. She gave him her shield, a shield of bronze, polished until it shone like a mirror, and she told him how to use it. When you come to Medusa, Athena said, you must never, for any reason, look so upon her face directly, or you will be turned to stone in an instant, like all the heroes before you. Instead, look only at her reflection in the polished surface of this shield. Fight her, not by looking at her, but by looking at her mirror image, and in that way you may face her and strike her, and never once meet the gaze that kills. There it is, the secret at the heart of the whole story, handed to Perseus by the goddess of wisdom. The only way to face the thing you cannot bear to look upon is to look at it indirectly through a reflection. To turn your eyes not to the horror itself, but to its image in a mirror, and so to see it, and to face it, and to defeat it, without ever letting it turn you to stone. Hold on to that. It is the truth this whole tale was built to teach. And so, armed with the winged sandals, and the cap of invisibility, and the magic pouch, and the adamantine blade, and, above all, the mirrored shield, Perseus flew on the winds to the very edge of the world, to the lonely lair of the Gorgons. And he came down among the terrible garden of stone statues, the frozen figures of all who had come before him, and failed. And he saw the 3 Gorgon sisters lying asleep among them, and keeping his eyes fixed always and only on the bright bronze mirror of Athena's shield, never once turning them toward the monsters themselves. Perseus crept forward. Think of the discipline it took, the strange and terrible discipline of that approach. Every instinct in a human being coming upon a sleeping monster in the half-dark screams at you to look, to fix your eyes upon the danger, to watch it directly, to keep it in your sight. And Perseus had to do the exact opposite. He had to keep his eyes turned away from the very thing he had come all this way to face, to trust the small bright world inside the mirror over the evidence of his own eyes, to walk backward toward a horror he could see only in reflection, knowing that a single instant of ordinary human instinct, one glance, one natural turning of the head toward the thing that all his nerves were fixed upon, would turn him instantly to stone among the statues. It was a fight against his own instincts as much as against the Gorgon. In the reflection, he found Medusa, the mortal one, the one he had come to kill, asleep. Among her immortal sisters, the serpents, of her hair coiling and hissing, even in her sleep, restless, as though the snakes themselves never truly slept even when their mistress did. Perseus watched her only in the bronze, and he crept closer and closer, guiding every step and every motion by the mirror image alone, the shield held before him, the curved blade raised in his other hand, his own face turned resolutely aside. And when he was near enough, watching only her reflection, judging the distance and the angle entirely by the image in the polished bronze, Perseus struck. With a single stroke of the adamantine sickle, guided by the mirror, and not by his eyes, he struck off the head of Medusa. And here a strange wonder occurred, for from the severed neck of the dying Gorgon, there sprang, fully formed, 2 extraordinary beings. Chrysaor, a warrior with a golden sword, and Pegasus, the magnificent winged horse, white as sea foam, who leapt up from Medusa's blood and beat his great wings and rose into the sky. These were the children of Medusa and Poseidon, held within her all that time, released into the world in the very instant of her death, as though, out of all that horror and that blood, something of terrible beauty was born, the winged horse that would one day carry other heroes to glory. There is a strange tenderness in that detail, tucked into the middle of a beheading, and the old poets loved it. That, from the neck of the slain monster, in the very moment of her death, there sprang not more horror, but a creature of soaring, snow-white beauty, rising up on great wings into the dawn. If the darker stories are true, and Medusa was once a wronged and beautiful girl, before she was ever a monster, then perhaps Pegasus was the last of that lost beauty, set free at last from the horror she had been cursed into, a thing of grace, escaping upward out of a life of stone and serpents. It is the kind of image these myths give us to hold two feelings at once: the triumph of the hero and the sorrow of the thing he had to kill. Perseus, still not looking, swept the severed head into the magic pouch and drew it tight. But the deed had woken the other two Gorgons, the immortal sisters, who rose up, shrieking in fury at the murder of their kin. And here was the danger that no blade could answer, for these two could not be killed at all. They were deathless. And if they caught him, they would tear him apart. And no sword or sickle in the world could stop them. They spread their great wings and hurled themselves into the air, their serpent hair writhing, their bronze claws reaching, hunting the length and breadth of the sky for the one who had slain their sister. And now the last of the gifts saved his life. Perseus pulled on the cap of Hades, the helm of the Lord of the Dead, and vanished from sight entirely, became nothing, a patch of empty air, invisible even to the monster's rage. And on his winged sandals he fled up into the sky, and away the magic pouch, heavy at his side with its terrible burden, while below and around him the two immortal sisters wheeled and shrieked and searched, passing close enough, perhaps, to feel the wind of his passing, and never once able to find the enemy who was flying right beside them, unseen. It is the perfect final proof of the wisdom that had guided the whole quest, that Perseus survived the two things he could never have defeated: the deadly gaze he could not meet, and the immortal sisters he could not kill, not by fighting them at all, but by not being seen, by looking away, by slipping past the unbeatable, rather than throwing himself against it. He had gone to the edge of the world and taken the one head that could be taken, and left the two that could not, and vanished into the air before their fury could fall on him. And so, unseen and unpursued, carrying the head that would turn his enemies to stone, Perseus turned for home. He had done it. He had killed the thing that could not be killed, faced the face that could not be faced, and lived. And he had done it not by being stronger or braver than the 100 heroes turned to stone around him, but by the wisdom to look only at the reflection, and the humility to accept the help and the gifts of the gods. The long flight home carried Perseus over strange and distant lands, and the old tellers filled that journey with wonders. There is a tale that as he passed over the far western edge of the world, weary and looking for a place to rest, he came to the realm of the Titan Atlas, a giant of immense size of Pegasus, who ruled a distant land of golden orchards. And Perseus asked him only for the simple hospitality that the old laws of the gods required: a place to rest for the night. But Atlas had once been warned by a prophecy of his own that a son of Zeus would one day come and rob him of his golden apples, and so, fearing this stranger who named himself a son of Zeus, Atlas refused him roughly and moved to drive him away by force. And Perseus, weary and far smaller than the giant, and unable to match his strength, did the only thing he could. He turned his own face away, and he said, "Since you will give me nothing else, then let me give you a gift instead." and he drew out the head of Medusa and held it up before the giant. And Atlas, in all his vastness, was changed instantly to stone. His beard and hair became forests, his shoulders and hands became ridges, his bones became rock, and his head became a summit. And he grew and grew into an enormous mountain, so vast that upon his stone shoulders the whole weight of the sky and all its stars came to rest. And so the giant who would not give a tired traveler a bed became the great mountain range that bears his name to this day, holding up the heavens forever. Another of the many statues that this terrible head left scattered across the world. And they say that as Perseus flew on over the deserts of Libya, drops of blood fell from the Gorgon's severed head down onto the sands below, and that where each drop fell, it turned into a venomous serpent, which is why the old story says the deserts of that land have been full of poisonous snakes ever since. But the greatest adventure of his journey home, and the one that would shape the rest of his life, came when he flew over the coast of a distant kingdom and looked down and saw a sight that stopped his heart. A young woman chained to a rock at the edge of the sea, waiting to die. Her name was Andromeda, and she was a princess, the daughter of the king and queen of that land. And her presence there, chained and weeping upon the rock as the tide rose around her, was the fault not of anything she had done, but of her own mother's pride. For her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had boasted, had dared, in her vanity, to claim that she, or by some tellings her daughter Andromeda, was more beautiful than the Nereids, the seas, the sea nymphs, the 50 daughters of the sea. It seems such a small thing, a queen's idle boast about beauty, hardly worth the notice of the immortals. But that is the very lesson the old stories tell again and again, that the gods do not measure an offense by its size, but by the pride behind it, and that the careless vanity of the mighty has a way of falling as ruin upon the innocent below them. Cassiopeia spoke a few proud words, and did not think of them again. And the price was paid not by her, but by her daughter, chained to a rock, and not by her alone, but by the fishermen and villagers of the whole coast, whose homes the monster ravaged. And such boasts in these old tales are never forgiven by the gods. The offended sea nymphs complained to Poseidon, and Poseidon in his anger sent a great sea monster, an enormous serpent of the deep called Cetus, to ravage the coast of that kingdom, to rise from the waves and destroy the ships and the villages, and devour the people. And when the desperate king and queen consulted an oracle to learn how they might be saved from the monster, they received the most terrible answer of all, that the only way to appease the sea and turn the monster away was to sacrifice their own daughter to it, to chain the innocent Andromeda to a rock at the edge of the sea, and leave her there for the serpent to devour. And so, to save their kingdom, they had done it. They had chained their own daughter to the rock, and left her there alone to be eaten, paying for her mother's careless pride with her innocent life. Sit with the cruelty of that, for it is the same cruelty that runs all through this tale, sounded now in a new key. Just as Acrisius had condemned the innocent Danae for a prophecy she had not made, and cast an innocent baby into the sea, so now another innocent young woman is chained to a rock, to die for a boast she never spoke, offered up to a monster to pay a debt that was not hers. There she stood as the tide crept up around her ankles, so still and so pale that Perseus, first catching sight of her from high above, mistook her for a statue of marble set upon the rock, until he saw the wind stir her hair, and saw the tears running down her face, and understood that this was no statue, but a living girl, chained and abandoned, and waiting to die. It is a picture that has haunted artists and poets ever since. The beautiful innocent bound to the rock at the edge of the sea, punished for another's sin, with the monster rising and no help anywhere in sight. And it is precisely into that moment of utter helplessness, the innocent condemned, the parents weeping uselessly on the shore, the monster coming, and no one to stop it, that the hero falls out of the sky. And it was there, chained and doomed, and waiting for the monster to come, that Perseus, flying home with the Gorgon's head, looked down and saw her. He came down to her, and he asked her why she was chained there, and she told him, through her tears, the whole terrible story. And Perseus, looking at this brave and innocent young woman, condemned to die for a sin that was not hers, fell in love with her on the instant. He flew at once to her horrified parents, who stood watching helplessly from the shore, and he made them an offer and a bargain. He would slay the sea monster and save their daughter's life, if, in return, they would give her to him as his wife. And the desperate king and queen, with nothing to lose, agreed at once. And even as they spoke, the sea began to heave and boil far out beyond the breakers, and a great dark shape moved beneath the water, and then the monster Cetus rose up out of the deep, vast and terrible, a serpent of the sea longer than a ship, its coils breaking the surface in ridges, its jaws wide enough to swallow a man whole, surging through the water toward the chained and helpless girl upon the rock. Andromeda screamed, and her parents wailed helplessly upon the shore, and there was no time. And Perseus rose into the air on his winged sandals high above the waves, and looked down upon the monster the way an eagle looks down upon a snake in the grass. He drew his blade, and he hurled himself out of the sky. Now the old tellers loved this fight and lingered over it, for it was a battle between a creature of the deep and a hero of the air. The monster could not reach him where he flew, and so Perseus struck from above, diving down like a falling star to drive his blade into the great beast's back, and rising again before the snapping jaws could close on him. Again and again he stooped and struck and soared away, and the sea turned dark with the monster's blood, and the creature thrashed and roared and tried to drag its tormentor down into the water, but could never quite reach the darting shape above it. His winged sandals grew heavy and slick with spray and blood, and there was a moment, they say, when he nearly fell, when the soaked feathers nearly failed him over the churning sea. But he did not fall. Diving one last time, he drove his blade deep into the monster again and again, until at last the great serpent of the deep shuddered, and rolled, and sank down dead beneath the reddened waves. And by some tellings, at the very end, when the exhausted hero doubted his blade could finish it, he simply drew forth the head of Medusa and held it up before the dying monster's eyes, and turned the whole vast creature to stone. so that it settled to the sea floor as a reef of rock. But however the last blow fell, the monster was dead. Now some of the old tellers say he fought the serpent with his adamantine sickle alone, a long and desperate battle in the surf, diving and striking from the air like a great eagle upon a sea snake, until at last he drove his blade home and killed it. And others say that at the crucial moment he simply drew forth the head of Medusa and held it up before the monster's eyes, and turned the great serpent to stone, where it reared out of the waves, so that it sank as a lifeless island of rock beneath the sea. But however he did it, the monster was slain. The sea grew calm, and Perseus flew to the rock and broke the chains and lifted the rescued Andromeda gently down into freedom and safety. He had saved her life and won his bride, and the whole kingdom rejoiced. And so a wedding was prepared. In joy and in gratitude, the doomed princess restored to life and given to the hero who had fallen out of the sky to save her. The whole kingdom, so lately drowning in dread of the monster, now filled with music and feasting and light. And the king and queen who had wept as they chained their daughter to the rock now wept again, this time for gladness, and gave her to Perseus with their blessing. It should have been the end of the sorrow, but the story of Andromeda holds one more test, and it is a telling one, for it shows us the difference between this hero and the ones who came before. For at the wedding feast, as Perseus and Andromeda celebrated their marriage, there came a great disruption. A man named Phineus, the brother of the king, who had long ago been promised Andromeda's hand and had done nothing whatsoever to save her when the monster threatened, who had stood by and let her be chained to the rock to die, now appeared with a band of armed followers and demanded that Andromeda be given to him instead, and fell upon the wedding feast with drawn swords. It was a desperate and unequal fight. Perseus and a few friends, surrounded by a mob of armed men in the crowded hall, the wedding feast turned in an instant into a battlefield. Tables overturned, and cups scattered, and the bride weeping in terror, while swords flashed among the wedding garlands. For a time Perseus fought them the ordinary way, back to a great pillar, cutting down the boldest of his attackers, one after another, as they came at him, and his few loyal friends fought and fell around him, until he stood almost alone against a whole roomful of enemies closing in. There is a bitter irony the old tellers savored here, that Phineus, who now came with an army of swords to claim Andromeda, had been nowhere to be found when the sea monster threatened her, had stood silent and done nothing while she was chained to the rock to die, and now demanded her as his prize. Only once another man had risked everything to save her. He wanted the reward without the risk, the bride without the rescue, and he was willing to murder a hall full of wedding guests to take her. And for a time it seemed his numbers might simply overwhelm the exhausted hero by weight alone. But Perseus had one weapon that no number of swords could match. He cried out a warning to his own friends to look away, to cover their eyes, and then he drew forth from the pouch the head of Medusa and held it up before the attacking mob. And every man who looked upon it, in the very act of rushing forward with his sword raised, was frozen instantly into cold gray stone, so that the hall filled with statues of astonished warriors, caught forever in the moment of their assault. Phineus and all his followers, who had come to take by force the bride they had been too cowardly to save, ended their lives as a gallery of stone, monuments to their own treachery. And so Perseus kept the wife he had won, and the coward who would have stolen her got the same stone death that so many had gotten before. And now, at last, Perseus turned his winged sandals toward home, toward the island of Seriphos, where he had left his mother Danae all those long months before, and where the cruel king Polydectes still ruled. And he came home to find exactly what he had feared. In his absence, Polydectes had dropped all pretense. He had never truly meant to marry Hippodamia. The whole thing had been a scheme to send Perseus to his death and leave Danae defenseless, and with her son gone, believed dead on his hopeless quest. Polydectes had pursued Danae relentlessly, and she had been forced to flee for her safety, taking refuge, where else? At the altar of the gods, and with the one good man on the island, the kind fisherman Dictys, the king's own brother, who had sheltered her as best he could against his powerful sibling. Perseus arrived to find his mother a hunted fugitive in her own home, driven to seek sanctuary from a king who would not stop until he had her. And a cold anger settled over Perseus at what had been done in his absence. For he understood now fully the whole shape of the trick that had been played on him. The quest had never been about honor or about a royal wedding. It had been a scheme to send him to his death and leave his mother defenseless. And while he had been risking everything at the edge of the world, this king had spent the months hunting the very woman Perseus had gone to protect. And so Perseus went to the palace of Polydectes, where the king sat feasting among his cronies, secure and untroubled, certain that the young fool he had sent away was long since dead among the stones of the Gorgon's lair. And he walked into the hall. A murmur ran through the feast at the sight of him. Alive. Returned when he should have been a statue at the world's end. The king, recovering, seeing him alive, and choosing to mock his return, demanded with a sneer to know where the promised gift was. Where was the head of Medusa the young fool had sworn to bring? Surely, said Polydectes, laughing to his cronies. The boy had come back empty-handed, to be shamed before them all as a liar and a coward. And Perseus said, simply, that he had brought it, exactly as he had promised. And he told the few people in that hall, who were innocent in his own eyes, to look away. And then he lifted the head of Medusa high before the king and all his cruel court. And Polydectes, the tyrant who had tormented his mother and schemed for his death, and all his flattering courtiers around him, were turned in an instant into cold, silent stone, frozen forever in the very hall where they had mocked him. The tyrant was dead, turned to a statue by his own demand, to see the thing he had sent a young man to die fetching. And Perseus went and found his mother where she had taken refuge, hunted and afraid, and told her that it was over, that the king who had tormented her for so many years was a statue now, and that no one would ever hunt her again. After a lifetime of it, the prison in Argos, the box upon the sea, the long years of a tyrant's unwelcome pursuit, on Seriphos, Danae was free at last, and safe and reunited with the son she had sung to in the dark of the box so many years before, now grown into the hero who had come home to save her. And Perseus set his good foster father, Dictys, the poor and kindly fisherman who had pulled him from the sea as a baby, and sheltered his mother in her need, upon the throne of Seriphos, to rule the island justly in the tyrant's place. There is a deep rightness in that, and the story clearly means us to feel it. The two brothers of Seriphos had been a study in opposites all along. The cruel and powerful king and the poor and kindly fisherman. And now the wheel had turned, and the kindness that had asked for nothing was given everything, and the cruelty that had grasped for everything was left as cold gray stone. The kindness of Dictys, shown to two starving castaways, who could never repay him, remembered and repaid at last, was rewarded with a kingdom. And Danae was free, his quest complete, his mother safe, his enemies turned to stone. Perseus now did something that again sets him apart from so many heroes of the old tales. He gave the gifts back. He returned the winged sandals, and the cap of invisibility, and the magic pouch to the gods, and the nymphs from whom they had come, and the head of Medusa, the terrible weapon that had won him everything. He gave to the goddess Athena, who had helped him from the start. And Athena set the Gorgon's head upon her own shield, upon the great discus she bore, so that forever after the face that turned men to stone would blaze from the shield of the goddess of war and wisdom, a terror to her enemies. Perseus kept nothing of the magic and the power that had been lent to him. He had been given extraordinary help to accomplish an extraordinary task, and when the task was done, he returned it all, and became once more simply a man with a wife he loved, and a mother he had saved, and a life still to live. There is a quiet grace in that, a knowing of when to lay a thing down, that is rarer among heroes than any feat of arms. But there remained one thread of the story still unresolved, the oldest thread of all, the one from before Perseus was ever born, the prophecy. The oracle had told Acrisius long ago that his grandson would one day kill him. And Acrisius, hearing it, had locked away his daughter and cast her and her baby into the sea, and spent his whole life running from that foretold death. And Acrisius was still alive, an old man now, still king in Argos, or fled from it in fear. For when word reached him that his grandson Perseus had survived, after all, had become a great hero, and was now alive and returning, the old terror seized Acrisius once more, and he fled from his own city, and went into hiding far away, in the land of Thessaly, still trying, even now, after all these years, to escape the death that had been promised him. And Perseus, for his part, bore his grandfather no hatred, and sought no revenge. He knew by now the story of how he and his mother had been cast into the sea, but he had no wish to kill the old man. He wished, if anything, to be reconciled with him, to know his grandfather at last. And so it happened that Perseus, traveling through Thessaly, came to the city of Larissa, where the king was holding a great festival of funeral games, contests of running and wrestling, and the throwing of the discus, in honor of his dead father. And Perseus, young and strong and glad of the sport, entered the games and took his turn at the throwing of the discus. and he threw. And the heavy stone discus flew from his hand. But a gust of wind caught it, some say, or it simply went astray, as such things do, and it veered from its course, and flew with the watching crowd, and struck an old man standing there, and killed him. And the old man was Acrisius, his grandfather, come, by pure chance, to the very same games, standing, by pure chance, in the very spot where the discus fell. After a whole lifetime of running after the tower and the sealed chamber and the box, cast into the sea, after every cruelty and every desperate scheme to escape it. The prophecy came true, exactly as the oracle had foretold, in the one way no one could have prevented, because no one had intended it at all. Perseus had killed his grandfather, not in anger, not in revenge, not by any design of his own, but by a blind accident, a stray discus, and a gust of wind at a friendly game. Fate had come for Acrisius at last, and it had used, as its instrument, the very grandson he had tried so hard to destroy, and it had done so through no malice, no plan, no wickedness of any kind, simply through the quiet, patient, unbreakable working out of a thing that had been decreed long ago and could never truly be escaped. And when Perseus learned who the old man was that his discus had killed, when they told him the name of the stranger lying dead in the crowd, and he understood that this was Acrisius, his own grandfather, the man whose blood ran in his veins, he was struck with a deep and genuine grief. He had not wanted this. He had come to Thessaly with no thought of his grandfather at all, had thrown the discus in nothing but the innocent joy of the games, and had killed, by pure and terrible accident, the one man in all the world it had been foretold he would kill. There was no triumph in it for him, no satisfaction of an old wrong avenged, only sorrow, and a kind of awe, and perhaps a cold shiver at the understanding that had come too late to everyone, that the old man had spent his whole life and done so much evil, running from this exact moment, and that all his running had only carried him here, to a festival in a far city, to stand in the precise spot where his grandson's discus would fall. Everything Acrisius had done to prevent this death had led directly to it. Had he never cast the baby into the sea, Perseus would have grown up in Argos, and the two might never have been strangers meeting, by chance, at distant games at all. The prophecy did not need Acrisius's help to come true, but his frantic efforts to escape. It had been, all along, the very machinery by which it worked. Sit with the meaning of that, for it is the deepest lesson the whole long tale has to teach. Acrisius spent his entire life trying to prevent this exact moment. Every cruel thing he did, imprisoning his daughter, casting a mother and infant into the sea, fleeing his own kingdom in fear, he did in order to escape the prophecy. And every single one of those cruelties was a step along the road that led, in the end, straight to the prophecy's fulfillment. Had he never imprisoned Danae, never cast Perseus into the sea, never fled to Larissa, had he simply lived his life and let the future come, who can say how it might have gone? But by struggling so hard against his fate, by doing evil after evil to try to escape it, he only wove the very net that caught him. The harder he ran from his death, the more surely his own running carried him toward it. It is one of the oldest and most haunting ideas in all of human storytelling, and the Greeks returned to it again and again, that fate cannot be escaped by cunning or by cruelty, and that the man who spends his life fleeing his destiny usually runs, by the very act of fleeing, straight into its arms. And there is a second truth here, quieter but just as important, and it lives in the difference between the grandfather and the grandson. Acrisius could not control his fate, no one can, but he could control the kind of man he was while he met it, and he chose to be cruel and fearful and faithless, spilling innocence to save himself, and he died as he had lived, alone and afraid. Perseus, too, could not escape his part in the prophecy. He killed his grandfather, as it was written he would. But everything else about how Perseus met his life, he chose, and he chose well. He kept his promise to bring back the head. He kept faith with the gods who helped him and returned their gifts. He rescued Andromeda and married her, and, unlike Jason and Theseus before him, he never abandoned her, never betrayed her, but loved her faithfully all his days. He remembered and rewarded the kindness of the humble fisherman who had saved him. What was fated he could not change, but the shape of his own soul, the faithfulness, the mercy, the gratitude, that was his own, and no oracle had decreed it, and it made all the difference between his story and his grandfather's. For the end of Perseus is, almost uniquely, among the great Greek heroes, a happy one, and it is happy precisely because of the kind of man he chose to be, grieved and ashamed at having killed his grandfather, even by accident. Perseus could not bring himself to take up the throne of Argos that was now his by right, for it seemed a terrible thing to inherit a kingdom by the death of the man he had killed, however unwillingly. And so he did, a remarkable thing, and it tells us everything about the kind of man he was. Argos was his, by right now, the throne of his grandfather, the inheritance he had been born to, the very kingdom for the sake of whose succession Acrisius had committed all his crimes, and Perseus would not take it. It seemed to him a shameful thing to sit upon the throne of a man he had killed, even by accident, to profit from a death he had caused, however innocently. And so, rather than claim Argos, he arranged to exchange kingdoms with a cousin who ruled nearby, giving up the throne he had every right to, and taking a lesser realm in its place, so that he need never build his house upon his grandfather's grave. Think how rare that is among the heroes and kings of these old tales. A man who is handed a great kingdom and turns it down, out of nothing but a scruple of conscience, a refusal to be seen to have gained by another's death. And there, in the new kingdom he took instead, Perseus founded a great city of his own, built with his own hands and his own name upon it, the city of Mycenae, which would rise to become one of the mightiest cities in all of Greece, golden Mycenae, the seat of kings for generations to come, the very city from which, ages later, a king named Agamemnon would one day sail against Troy. And he and Andromeda lived a long life together and had many children, and their marriage, begun on a rock at the edge of the sea, in the shadow of a monster, endured to the end of their days, faithful and unbroken. And this is the quiet miracle at the heart of Perseus's story, the thing that sets it apart from nearly every other hero's tale we have told. He did not tire of Andromeda and abandon her on some island, as Theseus abandoned Ariadne. He did not cast her aside for a more advantageous match, as Jason cast aside Medea. The princess he rescued from the rock became the wife he loved and kept for a lifetime. And she followed him from her father's distant kingdom all the way home to a new life in a new land, and stood beside him through everything that came after, and grew old with him in honor and in peace. Among the descendants of their long and faithful line, generations later, would be born the greatest hero of them all, mighty Heracles himself, so that the blood of Perseus and the faithful Andromeda ran on through the whole golden age of heroes, and half the royal houses of Greece would trace their line back to the fisherman's foster son, and the girl he lifted down from the rock. And when at last Perseus and Andromeda died, having lived full and honored lives, the gods did them a final kindness. They set them both among the stars as constellations, to shine in the night sky forever. Perseus and Andromeda side by side, with her boastful mother Cassiopeia nearby, and Cepheus her father, and even the sea monster Cetus and the winged horse Pegasus, all of them lifted up into the heavens, so that on any clear night, even now, thousands of years later, you can look up and find them there, the whole cast of this ancient story, turning slowly overhead in the dark. And so we return, at the very last, to the strange truth we began with, to the thing that cannot be looked at directly, and the mirror that lets us face it. For that image lies at the very heart of the tale of Perseus, and it means more, perhaps, than the story ever says aloud. Perseus could not defeat Medusa by looking at her. To meet that horror head-on, to stare directly into the face of the thing that turns men to stone, was to be destroyed by it. As 100 heroes had been destroyed before him, he could only defeat her by looking at her reflection, by facing the unbearable thing, indirectly in a mirror at one remove, where its power to freeze and destroy him was broken. And there is a wisdom in that far older and far deeper than any tale of monsters. For all of us, in our own lives, carry things we cannot bear to look at directly, griefs and fears and truths about ourselves and our lives, too terrible to meet head-on. And the tale of Perseus whispers to us, across 3,000 years, that this is not cowardice and not weakness, that sometimes the only way to face the unbearable thing is not to stare straight into it, but to catch it sidelong, in a reflection, in a story, in a song, in the gentle mirror of another's understanding, and so to see it, and to face it, and even to defeat it, without being turned to stone. That, perhaps, is what these old myths themselves have always been. The polished shield the human race holds up to the horrors it cannot look at directly, so that we may face them safely, in reflection, and live. Think of how much this one tale has quietly gathered up into itself, and handed to us, wrapped in the shape of an adventure. It has shown us a man so terrified of his own death that he did evil after evil to escape it, and learned that fate cannot be cheated. It has shown us the difference between a soul that meets its fate with cruelty and one that meets it with faith. It has shown us that the impossible is overcome not by being the strongest, but by accepting help and using wisdom, and approaching the unbearable sidelong through a mirror It has shown us a monster who was also a victim, and a hero who was also, once, a helpless baby, saved only by a mother's refusal to despair, and a poor man's simple kindness. All of that carried across 3,000 years in a story about winged sandals and a snake-haired Gorgon. The deep truths of a human life, smuggled to us inside a tale we could bear to hear, because it came to us in reflection, at one safe remove in the polished bronze of myth. Perseus killed the Gorgon, and rescued the princess, and kept his faith, and could not escape his fate, but chose the shape of his own soul, and lived a long life, and was set at last among the stars. Look up for him on a clear night. He is there still. Rest now. Let the slow turning of the stars, the same stars that hold Perseus and his faithful Andromeda, shining side by side, wheel gently overhead. Let the sea that carried a mother and her baby safely to shore grow calm and quiet. And as you drift down into sleep, remember the mirror and the shield and the quiet wisdom at the heart of this old and starlit tale. That even the things we cannot bear to look at, we can face at last, and even the fate we cannot escape, we can meet with a faithful and a gentle heart. Sleep now and rest.